So he sought Orlando in his room and explained that he had not been able to sleep a wink all night because of the silence. Indeed, the house was surrounded by a park 15 miles in circumference and a wall 10 feet high. Silence, he said, was one of the things the most oppressive to his nerves. He would end his visit by Orlando's leave that very morning. Orlando felt some relief at this, yet also a great reluctance to let him go. The house, he thought, would seem very dull without him. On parting, for he had never yet liked to mention the subject, he had the temerity to press his play upon the death of Hercules upon the poet and ask his opinion of it. The poet took it, muttered something about Glor and Cicero, which Orlando cut short by promising to pay the pension quarterly. Whereupon Green, with many protestations of affection, jumped into the coach and was gone. The great hall had never seemed so large, so splendid, or so empty as the chariot rolled away. Orlando knew that he would never have the heart to make toasted cheese in the Italian fireplace again. He would never have the wit to crack jokes about Italian pictures, never have the skill to mix punch as it should be mixed. 1,000 good quips and cranks would be lost to him. Yet what a relief to be out of the sound of that querulous voice, what a luxury to be alone once more. So he could not help reflecting as he unloosened the mastiff which had been tied up these 6 weeks because it never saw the poet without biting him. Nick Green was set down at the corner of Fetter Lane that same afternoon, and found things going on much as he had left them. Mrs. Green, that is to say, was having birth to a baby in one room. Tom Fletcher was drinking gin in another. Books were tumbling all about the floor. Dinner, such as it was set on a dressing table where the children had been making mud pies. But this, Green felt, was the atmosphere for writing. Here he could write, and write he did. The subject was made for him. A noble lord at home. A visit to a noble man in the country. His new poem was to have some such title as that. Seizing the pen with which his little boy was ticking the cat's ear and dripping it in the egg cup which served for ink pot, Green dashed off a very spirited satire there and then. It was so done to a turn that no one could doubt that the young lord who was roasted was Orlando. His most private sayings and doings, his enthusiasms and follies, down to the very colour of his hair and the foreign way that he had been rolling his R's, were there to the life. And if there had been any doubt about it, Green clinched the matter by introducing the scarcely any disguised passages from that aristocratic tragedy, the death of Hercules, which he found, as he expected, wordy and bombastic in the extreme. The pamphlet, which ran at once into several editions, and paid the expenses of Mrs. Green's 10th lying in, was soon sent by friends who take care of such matters to Orlando himself. When he had read it, which he did with deadly composure from start to finish, he rang for the footman, delivered the document to him, and at the end of a pair of tongs bade him drop it into the filthiest heart of the foulest maiden on the estate. Then, when the man was turning to go, he stopped him. "Take the swiftest horse in the stable," he said. "Ride for dear life to Harwich. There embark upon a ship which you will find bound for Norway. And buy for me from the king's own kennels the finest elk hounds of the royal strain, male and female. Bring them back without delay. For," he muttered, scarcely above his breath as he turned to his books, "I have done with men." The footman, who was perfectly trained in his duties, bowed and disappeared. He fulfilled his task so efficiently that he was back that day 3 weeks, leading in his hand a fresh of the finest elk hounds, one of whom, a female, gave birth that very night under the dinner table to a litter of 8 fine puppies. Orlando had had them brought to his bedchamber. "For," he said, "I have done with men." Nevertheless, he paid the pension quarterly. Thus, at the age of 30 or thereabouts, this young nobleman had not only had every experience that life has to offer, but had seen the worth of them all. Love and ambition, women and poets were all equally vain. Literature was a farce. The night after reading Green's visit to the nobleman in the country, he burnt in a great conflagration 57 poetical works, only retaining the oak tree, which was his boyish dream and very short. Two things alone reminded him in which he was now put any trust: dogs and nature, an elk hound and a rose bush. The world in all its variety, life in all its complexity, had shrunk to that. Dogs and a bush were the whole of it. So feeling a quit of vast mountain of illusion, and very naked in consequence, he called his hounds to him and strode through the park. So long had he been secluded, writing and reading, that he had half forgotten the amenities of nature, which in June can be great. When he reached that high mound whence on fine days half of England, with a slice of Wales and Scotland thrown in, could be seen, he flung himself under the favourite oak tree, and felt that if he need never speak to another man or woman so long as he lived, if the dogs did not develop the full faculty of speech, if he never met a poet or a princess again, he might make out what years remained to him in tolerable content. Here he came then, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. He saw the beech trees turn golden, and the young ferns unfurl. He saw the moon sickle and then circular. He saw, but probably the reader can imagine the passage which should follow, and how every tree and plant in the neighbourhood is described first green, then golden, how moons rise and suns set, how spring follows winter and autumn summer, how night succeeds day and day night, how there is first a storm and then fine weather, how things remain much as they are for 200 or 300 years or so, except for a little dust and a few cobwebs which one old woman can sweep up in half an hour. A conclusion which one cannot help feeling might have been reached far more quickly by the simple statement that time passed. Here the exact amount could be indicated in brackets, and nothing whatever happened. But time, unfortunately, though it makes animals and vegetables bloom and fade with amazing punctuality, has no such simple effect upon the mind of man. The mind of man, moreover, works with equal strangeness upon the body of time. An hour, once it lodges in the queer elements of the human spirit, may be stretched to 50 or 100 times its clock length. On the other hand, an hour may be accurately represented on the timepiece of the mind by 1 second. This extraordinary discrepancy between time on the clock and time in the mind is less known than it should be, and deserves fuller investigation. But the biographer, whose interests are, as we have said, highly restricted, must confine himself to one simple statement. When a man has reached the age of 30, as Orlando now had, time when he is thinking becomes inordinately long. Time when he is doing becomes inordinately short. Thus Orlando gave his orders and did the business of the vast estates in a flash. But directly he was alone on the mound under the oak tree, the seconds began to go round and fill until it seemed as if they would never fall. They filled themselves moreover with the strangest variety of objects. For not only did he find himself confronted by problems which had puzzled the wisest of men, such as what is love, what is friendship, what is truth, but directly he came to think about them, his whole past, which seemed to him of extreme length and variety, rushed into the falling seconds, swelled it a dozen times its natural size, coloured it 1,000 tints, and filled it with all the odds and ends in the universe. In such thinking, or by whatever name it should be called, he spent months and years of his life. It would be no exaggeration to say that he would go out after breakfast a man of 30, and come home to dinner a man of 55 at least. Some weeks added a century to his age, others no more than 3 seconds at most. Altogether the task of estimating the length of human life, of animals we presume not to speak, is beyond our capacity, for directly we say that it is ages long, we are reminded that it is briefer than the fall of a rose leaf to the ground. On the two forces which alternatively, and what is more confusing still, at the same moment, dominate our unfortunate numbskulls, brevity and diuturnity, Orlando was sometimes under the influence of the elephant-footed deity, then of the gnat-winged fly. Life seemed to him of prodigious length, yet even so it went like a flash. But even when it stretched longest, and the moments swelled biggest, and he seemed to wander alone in deserts of vast eternity, there was no time for the smoothing out and deciphering of those thickly scored parchments which 30 years amongst men and women had rolled tight in his heart and brain. Long before he had done thinking about love, the oak tree had put forth its leaves and shaken them to the ground a dozen times in process. Ambition would jostle it off the field to be replaced by friendship or literature, and as the first question had not been settled, what is love, back it would come at the least provocation or none, and hustled books or metaphors or what one lives for into the margin, there to wait till they saw their chance to rush into the field again. What made the process still longer was that it was profusely illustrated, not only with pictures as that of old Queen Elizabeth laid on her tapestried couch in rose-coloured brocade, with an ivory snuff-box in her hand and a gold-hilted sword by her side, but with scents. She was strongly perfumed, and with sounds. The stags were barking in Richmond's Park that winter's day, and so the thought of love would be all ambered over with snow and winter, with log fires burning, with Russian women, gold swords, and the bark of stags, with old King James slobbering, and fireworks and sacks of treasure in the holds of Elizabethan sailing ships. Every single thing, once he tried to dislodge it from its place in his head, he found thus cumbered with other matter, like the lump of glass which after a year at the bottom of the sea is grown about with bones and dragonflies and coins and the tresses of drowned women. Another metaphor by Jupiter, he would exclaim as he said this, which will show the disorderly and circuitous way in which his mind works, and explain why the oak tree flowed and faded so often before he came to any conclusion about love. And what's the point of it, he would ask himself. Why not say simply in so many words? And then he would try to think for half an hour, or was it 2 years and a half, how to say simple in so many words what love is. A figure that is manifestly untruthful, he argued. For no dragonfly, unless under a very exceptional circumstance, could live at the bottom of the sea. And if literature is not the bride and bedfellow of truth, what is she? Confound it all, he cried. Why say bedfellow when one's already said bride? Why not simply say what one means and leave it? So then he tried saying the grass is green, that the sky is blue, and to appropriate the austere spirit of poetry, whom still, though at a great distance, he could not help reverencing. The sky is blue, he said, the grass is green. Looking up, he saw that, on the contrary, the sky is like the veils which his thousand Madonnas have let fall from their hair, and the grass fleets. It darkens like a flight of girls fleeting in the embraces of hairy strangers from enchanted woods. Upon my word, he said, for he had fallen into the bad habit of speaking aloud, I don't see that one's more true than another. Both are utterly false. And he despaired of being able to solve the problem of what poetry is and what truth is, and fell into a deep dejection. And here we may profit by a pause in his soliloquy to reflect how odd it was to see Orlando stretched there on his elbows in a June day, and to reflect that this fine fellow, with all his faculties about him, and a healthy body, witness cheeks and limbs, a man who never thought twice about heeding a charge or of fighting a duel, should be so subject to the lethargy of thought and rendered susceptible by it, and when it came to a question of poetry, or his own competence in it, he was as shy as a little girl behind her mother's cottage door. In our belief, Green's ridicule of his tragedy helped him as much as the princess' ridicule of his love. But to return. Orlando went on thinking. He kept looking at the grass and at the sky, and trying to bethink him what a true poet who has his verses published in London would say about him. Memory, meanwhile, whose habits have already been described, kept steady before his eyes the face of Nicholas Green, as if it was sardonic, loose-lipped man, treacherous as he had proved himself, were the Muse in person, and it was to him that Orlando must be to do homage. So Orlando, that summer morning, offered him a variety of phrases, some plain, others figured, and Nick Green kept shaking his head and sneering and muttering something about Gloria and Cicero and the death of poetry in our time. At length, starting to his feet, it was now winter and very cold, Orlando swore one of the most unremarkable oaths of his lifetime, for it bound him to a servitude than which none is stricter. "I'll be blasted," he said, "if ever I write another word or try to write another word to please Nick Green or the Muse. Bad, good, or indifferent, I'll write from this day forward to please myself." And here he made as he were tearing a whole budget of papers across and tossing them in the face of what sneered loose-lipped man, upon which, as a cur ducks if you stoop to throw a stone at him, Memory ducked her effigy of Nick Green out of sight, and substituted for it nothing whatsoever. But Orlando, all the same, went on thinking. He had indeed much to think of, for when he tore the parchment across, he tore in one rendering the scrolloping emblazoned scroll which he had made out in his own favour in the solitude of his room, appointing himself as the king appoints ambassadors, the first poet of his race, the first writer of his age, conferring eternal immortality upon his soul and granting his body a grave among laurels and the intangible banners of the people's reverence perpetually. Eloquent as this all was, he now tore it up and threw it in the dustbin. "Fame," he said, "is like," and since there was no Nick Green to stop him, he went on to revel in images of which we will choose only one or two of the quietest. A braided coach which hampers the limbs, a jacket of silver which curbs the heart, a painted shield which covers a scarecrow, etc., etc. The pith of his phrases was that while fame impedes and constricts, obscurity wraps about a man like a mist. Obscurity is dark, ample, and free. Obscurity lets the mind take its way unimpeded. Over the obscure man is poured the merciful suffocation of darkness. None knows where he goes or comes. He may seek the truth and speak it. He alone is free. He alone is truthful. He alone is at peace. And so he sank into a quiet mood under the oak tree, the hardness of whose roots exposed above the ground seemed to him rather comfortable than otherwise. Sunk for a long time in profound thoughts as to the value of obscurity and the delight of having no name, but being like a wave which returns to the deep body of the sea, thinking how obscurity rids the mind of the irk and envy of spite, how it sets running in the veins the free waters of generosity and magnanimity, and allows giving and taking without thanks offered or praise given, which must have been the way of all great poets, he supposed, though his knowledge of Greek was not enough to bear him out, for he thought Shakespeare must have written like that, and the church builders build like that, anonymously, needing no thanks or naming, but only their work in the daytime and a little ale perhaps at night. What an admirable life this is, he thought, stretching his limbs out under the oak tree, and why not enjoy it this very moment? The thought struck him like a bullet. Ambition dropped like a plummet, rid of the heartburn of rejected love and of vanity rebuked, and all the other stings and pricks which the nettled bed of life had burnt upon him when ambitious of fame, but could no longer inflict upon one careless of glory. He opened his eyes, which had been wide open all the time, but had seen only thoughts, and saw, lying in the hollow beneath him, the house. There it lay in the early sunshine of spring. It looked a town rather than a house, but a town built, not hither and thither, as this man wished or that, but circumspectly by a single architect, with one idea in his head. Courts and buildings, grey, red, plum colour, lay orderly and symmetrical. The courts were some of them oblong and some square. In this was a fountain, in that a statue. The buildings were some of them low, some pointed. Here was a chapel, there a belfry. Spaces of the greenest grass lay in between the clumps of cedar trees, and beds of bright flowers. All were clasped. Yet so well set out was it that it seemed that every part of the room had spread itself fittingly by the roll of a massive wall. While smoke from innumerable chimneys curled perpetually into the air, this vast yet ordered building, which could house 1,000 men and perhaps 2,000 horses, was built, Orlando thought, by workmen whose names are unknown. Here have lived, for more centuries than I can count, the obscure generations of my own obscure family. Not one of these Richards, Johns, Annes, Elizabeths has left a token of himself behind him. Yet all, working together, with their spades and their needles, their love-making and their childbearing, have left this. Never had the house looked more noble and humane. Why, then, had he wished to raise himself above them? For it seemed vain and arrogant in the extreme to try to better that enormous work of creation, the labours of those vanished hands. Better was it to go unknown and leave behind you an arch, a potted shed, a wall where peaches ripen, than to burn like a meteor and leave no dust. For after all, he said, kindling as he looked at the great house on the greensward below, the unknown lords and ladies who lived there never forgot to set aside something for those who come after, for the roof that will leak, for the trees that will fall. There was always a warm corner for the old shepherd in the kitchen. Always food for the hungry, always goblets were polished though they lay sick, and their windows were lit though they lay dying. Lords though they were content to go down into obscurity with the mole-catcher and the stonemason. Obscure noblemen, forgotten builders. Thus he apostrophized them with warmth that eternally gainsaid such critics as called him cold, indifferent, slothful, the truth being that equality often lies just on the outer side of the wall from where we seek it. Thus he apostrophized his house and race in terms of the most moving eloquence. But when it came to the peroration, and what is eloquence that lacks peroration, he fumbled. He would have liked to have ended with a flourish to the effect that he would follow in their footsteps and add another stone to their building. Since, however, the building already covered 9 acres, to add even a single stone seemed superfluous. Could one mention furniture in a peroration? Could one speak of chairs and tables and mats and lie beside people's beds? For whatever the peroration wanted, that was what the house stood in need of. Leaving his speech unfinished for the moment, he strode downhill again, resolved henceforward to devote himself to the furnishing of the mansion. The news that she was to attend him instantly brought tears to the eyes of good old Mr. Grimstitch, now grown somewhat old. Together they perambulated the house. The tail horse in the king's bedroom, and that was King Jamie, my lord, she said, hinting that it was many a day since a king had slept under their roof, but the odious Parliament days were over, and there was now a crown in England again, lacked a leg. There were no stands to the ewers in the little closet leading into the waiting room of the Duchess's page. Mr. Green had made a stain on the carpet with his nasty pipe smoking, which she and Judy, for all their scrubbing, had never been able to wash out. Indeed, when Orlando came to reckon up the matter of furnishing with rosewood chairs and cedarwood cabinets, silver basins, china bowls, Persian carpets, every one of 365 bedrooms which the house contained, he saw that it would be no light one, and if some thousands of pounds of his estate remained over, these would do little more than hang a few galleries with tapestry, set the dining hall with fire, carved chairs, and provide mirrors of solid silver and chairs of the same metal, for which he had an inordinate passion, for the furnishing of the royal bedchambers. He now set to work in earnest, as we can prove beyond a doubt if we look at his ledgers. Let us glance at an inventory of what he bought at this time, with the expenses trotted up in the margin, but these we omit. To 50 pairs of Spanish blankets, ditto curtains of crimson white taffeta, the valance to them of which white satin embroidered with crimson and white silk, 70 yellow satin chairs, and 60 stools sustainable with buckram covers to them all, to 67 walnut tree tables, to 17 dozen boxes containing each dozen 5 dozen of Venice glasses, to 102 mats 30 yards long, to 97 cushions of crimson damsack laid with silver parchment lace, and foodstools of cloth and tissue, and chairs suitable to 50 branches for a dozen lights apiece. Already it is an effects list upon us. We are beginning to yawn. But if we stop, it is only that the catalogue is tedious, not that it is finished. There are 99 pages more of it, and the total sum dispersed ran into many thousands, that is to say, millions of our money. And if his day was spent like this at night again, Lord Orlando might be found reckoning out what it would cost to level 1,000,000 molehills. If the men were paid 10p an hour, and again how many hundred weights of nails at 5.5d a gill were needed to repair the fence around the park, which was 15 miles in circumference, and so on and so on. The tale, we say, is tedious, for one cupboard is much like another, and one molehill not much different from 1,000,000. Some pleasant journeys it cost him, and some fine adventures, as for instance when he set a whole city of blind women near Bruges to stitch hangings for a silver canopied bed, and the story of his adventure with a Moor in Venice, of whom he bought, but only at sword's point, his lacquered cabinet might in other hands prove worth the telling, nor did the work lack variety, for here would come, drawn by teams from Sussex, great trees to be sewn across and laid along the gallery for flooring, and then chests from Persia, stuffed with wool and sawdust, from which at last he saw take a single plate, or one topaz ring. At length, however, there was no room for the galleries for another table, no room on the tables for another cabinet, no room for the cabinet for another rose bowl, no room in the bowl for another handful of potpourri. There was no room for anything anywhere. In short, the house was furnished. In the garden, snowdrops, crocuses, hyacinths, magnolias, roses, lilies, asters, and dahlia, in all its varieties, pear trees and apple trees and cherry trees and mulberry trees, with an enormity of quantity of rare and flowering scrubs, of trees evergreen and perennial, grew so thick on each other's roots that there was no plot of earth without its bloom, and no stretch of sward without its shade. In addition, he had imported wildflowers with gay plumage, and 2 Malay bears, the surliness of whose manners concealed, he was certain, trusty hearts. All now was ready, and when it was evening, and innumerable silver scones were lit, and the light airs which for ever moved about the galleries stirred the blue and green arras, so that it looked as if the huntsmen were riding and Dauphin flying, when the silver shone and the lacquer glowed and the wood kindled, when the carved chairs held their arms out and dolphins swam upon the walls with mermaids on their backs, when all this and much more than all this was complete and to his liking, Orlando walked through the house with his elk hounds following and felt content. He had matters now, he thought, to fill out his peroration. Perhaps it would be well to begin the speech all over again. Yet, as he paraded the galleries, he felt that still something was lacking. Chairs and tables, however richly gilt and carved, sofas resting on lions' paws with swans' necks carved under him, beds, even of the softest swan's down, were not by themselves enough. People sitting in them, people lying on them improved them amazingly. Accordingly, Orlando now begins a series of very splendid entertainments to the nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood. The 365 bedrooms were full for a month at a time. Guests jostled each other to the 52 staircases. 300 servants bustled about the pantries. Banquets took place almost nightly. Thus, in a very few years, Orlando had worn the nap off his velvet and spent the half of his fortune, but he had earned the good opinion of his neighbours, held a score of offices in the country, and was annually presented with perhaps a dozen volumes dedicated to his lordship in rather fulsome terms by grateful poets. For though he was careful not to consort with writers at that time, and kept himself always aloof from ladies of foreign blood, still he was excessively generous to women and to poets, and both adored him. But when the feasting was at its height, and his guests were at their revels, he was apt to take himself off to his private room alone. There, when the door was shut and he was certain of privacy, he would have had an old writing book stitched together with silk stolen from his mother's workbox, and labelled in a round schoolboy hand, "The Oak Tree, a Poem." In this he would write till midnight chimed and long after, but as he scratched out as many lines as he wrote in, the sum of them was often, at the end of the year, rather less than at the beginning, and it looked as if in the process of writing the poem would be completely unwritten. For it is the historian of letters to remark that he had changed his style amazingly. His fluidity was chastened, his abundance curbed. The age of prose was congealing those warm fountains. The very landscape outside was less struck about with garlands, and the briars themselves were less thorned and intricate. Perhaps the senses were a little duller, and honey and cream less seductive to the palate. Also, that the streets were better drained and the houses better lit had its effect upon the style, it cannot be doubted. One day he was adding a line or two with enormous labour to the Oak Tree, a Poem, when a shadow crossed the tail of his eye. It was no shadow he soon saw, but the figure of a very tall lady in riding hood and mantle, crossing the quadrangle of which his room looked out. As this was the most private of the courts, and the lady was a stranger to him, Orlando marvelled how she had got there. 3 days later the same apparition appeared to him, and on Wednesday noon appeared once more. This time Orlando was determined to follow her, nor apparently was she afraid to be found, for she slackened her steps as he came up and looked him full in the face. Any other woman thus caught in a lord's private grounds would have been afraid. Any other woman with that face, head dress, and aspect would have thrown her mantilla across her shoulders and to hide it. For this lady resembled nothing so much as a hare startled but obdurate, a hare whose timidity is overcome by an immense and foolish audacity, a hare that sits upon and glowers in its pursuer with great bulging eyes, with ears erect but quivering, with nose pointed but twitching. This hare, moreover, was 6 foot high, and wore a headdress into the bargain of some antiquated kind, which made her look still taller. Thus confronted, she stared at Orlando with a stare in which timidity and audacity were most strangely combined. First she asked him, with a proper but somewhat clumsy curtsy, to forgive her intrusion. Then, rising to her full height again, which must have been something over 6 foot 2, she went on to say, but with such a cackle of nervous laughter, so much teething and haw-hawing, that Orlando thought she must have escaped from a lunatic asylum, that she was the Archduchess Harriet, Grandsire of Finster, Archhorn, and Scandop Boom in the Rumenian territory. She desired above all things to make his acquaintance, she said. She had taken lodgings over a barker's shop at the park gates. She had seen his picture, and it was the image of a sister of hers, who was, here she guffed, long since then. She was visiting the English court. The Queen was her cousin. The King was a very good fellow, but seldom went to bed sober. Here she tee-heed and haw-hawed again. In short, there was nothing but to ask her in and give her a glass of wine. Indoors her manners regained the haughtier nature to a Rumenian Archduchess, and had she not shown knowledge of wines rare in a lady, and made some observations upon firearms and the customs of sportsmen in a country, which were sensible enough, talk would have lacked spontaneity. Jumping to her feet at last, she announced that she would call the following day, swept another prodigious curtsy, and departed. Following day Orlando rode out. The next he turned back. On the third he drew his curtain. On the fourth it rained, and as he could not keep a lady in the wet, nor was altogether averse to company, he invited her in and asked her opinion whether a suit of armour, which belonged to an ancestor of his, was the work of Jacoboy or of Top. He inclined to Top. She held another opinion. It matters very little which, but it is of some importance to the course of our story that, in illustrating her argument, which had to do with the workings of the timepieces, the Archduchess Harriet took the golden shin case and fitted it to Orlando's leg. That he had a pair of shapeliest legs that any nobleman had ever stood upright upon has already been said. Perhaps something in the way she fastened the ankle buckle, or her stooping posture, Orlando's long seclusion, or the natural sympathy which is between the sexes, or the burgundy, or the fire, any of these causes may have been to blame, for certainly blame there is on one side or another when a nobleman of Orlando's breeding, entertaining a lady in his house, and she, his elder by many years, with a face a yard long and staring eyes, dressed somewhat ridiculously too, in a mantle riding cloak, through what the season was warm. Blame there is when a nobleman is so suddenly and violently overcome by passion of some sort that he has to leave the room. But what sort of passion, it may well be asked, could this be? And the answer is double-faced as love herself. For love, but leaving love out of the argument for a moment, the actual event was this. When the Archduchess Harriet Griselda stopped to fasten the buckle, Orlando heard suddenly and unaccountably far off the beating of love's wings. The distant stir of that soft plumage roused in him 1,000 memories of rushing waters, of loveliness in the snow and faithlessness in the flood, and the sound came nearer, and he blushed and trembled, and he was moved as he had thought never to be moved again. And he was ready to raise his hands and let the bird of beauty alight upon his shoulders, when horror! A creaking sound like that the crows make tumbling over the trees began to reverberate. The air seemed dark with coarse black wings. Voice croaked, bits of straw, twigs and feathers dropped, and there pitched down upon his shoulders the heaviest and foulest of birds, which is the vulture. Thus he rushed from the room and sent the footman to see the Archduchess Harriet to her cage. For love, to which we may now return, has two faces, one white, the other black, two bodies, one smooth, the other hairy. It has 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 nails, 2, indeed, of every member, and each one is the exact opposite of the other. Yet so strictly are they joined together that you cannot separate them. In this case, Orlando's love began her flight towards him, with her white face turned, and her smooth and lovely body outwards. Nearer and nearer she came wafting before her airs of pure delight. All of a sudden, at the sight of the Archduchess, presumably, she wheeled about, turned the other way round, showed herself black, hairy, brutish, and it was lust, the vulture, not love, the bird of paradise, that flopped foully and disgustingly upon his shoulders. Hence he ran, hence he fetched the footman. But the harpy is not so easily banished as all that. Not only did the Archduchess continue to lodge at the baker's, but Orlando was haunted every day and night by phantoms of the foulest kind. Vainly, it seemed, had he furnished his house with silver and hung the walls with arras, when at any moment a dung-begotted fowl could settle upon his writing-table. There she was, flopping about among the chairs. He saw her waddling ungracefully across the galleries. Now she perched top-heavy upon a fire-screen. When he chased her out, back she came and pecked at the glass till she broke it. Thus, realizing that his home was uninhabitable, and that steps must be taken to end the matter instantly, he did what any other young man would have done in his place, and asked King Charles to send him as ambassador extraordinarily to Constantinople. The king was walking in Whitehall. Now Gwen was on his arm. She was pelting him with hazelnuts. 'Twas 1,000 pities that amorous lady sighed that such a pair of legs should leave the country. Howbeit the fates were hard. She could do no more than toss one kiss over her shoulder before Orlando sailed.